Hello everyone, welcome back to our video series on introductory syntax. Today we are going to look at some sentences dealing with multiple auxiliaries and also look at a phenomenon known as head movement. As I mentioned in our last video, maybe not the most recent video, but the one or two before that, I'm presenting this material a little bit out of order with respect to the Kearney textbook, which is our primary text. So just as a reminder, we're using the 3rd edition. And here again, I'm going to diverge a little bit in some of my presentation of the material itself. I am going to present a version of some of these ideas that is a little bit distinct, but I'm going to talk about that and also present how you can do it in the same way that is done in Kearney. So really what we're going to be talking about today are combinations of both chapters 9 and chapters 10 if you're following along in the Kearney textbook. If you are, and then as we move forward, we're going to integrate what we do today in our next video with what we did in our previous videos, which is DP movements, to talk about a little bit more about the passive. So that's kind of where we're heading. And then from that, we'll build into looking at question formation, which is also going to be part of our videos today. We're going to look at the formation of yes-no questions. So just to refresh ourselves a little bit, we've been thinking about questions like, or sentences like, you know, Mary left the party. And we can tree a sentence like this quite easily. And we note certain things about this, that it has, according to our assumptions, it has a tense node, but this tense node is null, but it still is going to fill that T position. And we'll go ahead and tree the sentence just for our own edification. Apologize for the helicopter. We're right next to the hospital here, so you will get some noise from that. So Mary is in past, or not Mary, the sentence is in past. We have a verb phrase, and I'm just going to go ahead and do our DP as our DPs as triangles, because we've spent a decent amount of time on DP structure at this point. So she left. I have a DP down here. The party. And Mary will begin in the subject position of the VP and raise up to the subject position of the TP. And it will do this to get its case and because of the EPP. We can look at the full sentence here. And the party is fine where it is because it is current, according to our current assumptions, left is both a case position and is also a theta position. And Mary begins the derivation here, according to our current assumptions, because the specifier of the verb phrase is where it's receiving its theta role from the verb. And this is well and good, but we know that certain sentences can have more than just single T's. So we can handle this sentence if it said Mary could have left the party, or Mary had left the party. But English can stack these things. We could have the sentence Mary could have been leaving the party. Could have been well, that doesn't really fit within our structure. So one of the questions we have to say is, well, how are we going to do this? Well, following what the Carney text does is we're going to basically just put that highest tense or modal or whatever else is up there in that highest T position, and then we're just going to stack verb phrases down low. So if I take the sentence, Mary, I need a new marker. This one is just not working for us. Mary could have been leaving the party. So here's our sentence. Mary could have been leaving the party. Well, we can notice certain things about this sentence. And we'll pay attention to several of these things, but we now have these stacked verbal elements, these stacked auxiliaries. And we'll notice later on that these all have relationships to each other that seem to influence each other. So the way the way Carney deals with these is that he says, okay, well, we're going to treat leave in the same way we did before. Leave still has the same relationship it has with its arguments. Mary is still going to get its theta role from leave, and the party is still going to get its theta role from leave, and fundamentally still get case from leave. So we're going to go ahead and build that structure. And again, I'm just going to triangle our DPs, partially for space, partially because I'm lazy. But then the next question is, what happens? Where do we put things like been and have? Well, again, the way the textbook deals with this is it just stacks additional VPs on top. So we're going to put been have, and then inside that we'll have could inside our T. And eventually we might revise this to a certain extent. This is a first pass analysis with these stacked VPs. And then our TP here. But this is basically what is going to happen. So we have could, have, been. Have and been are both inside their own VPs, projecting their own VPs, which stack on top. Mary is still down inside the main VP, down low inside leave, where it's receiving its theta position. This is still not a case position. So Mary will raise into the specifier of T. We will talk later on about the potential of Mary stopping off in these other specifier positions of VP. But that will come in a little bit. That'll be down the road. So here's the basic idea. So I want to talk about a couple of core ideas behind this type of structure. So one of the things we want to, now talk about, and I shouldn't have erased this, but if we go back and look at the Carney textbook, we can notice the sort of relationship, and I'm just going to do this without the tree for a second. We can notice the types of relationships that exist between things like could, which really doesn't have an effect on what comes later, have, been, and then the main verb. So could, should, they don't really impact the next thing. So they don't change the morphological form. Well, and in a sense they do, insofar as you can't really put, can't say could, had. That's not good. So they have some requirements, but they don't impact the morphological form in forcing a particular morphological form to surface. Have typically requires either an en or ed marker to surface on the verb. If it's an auxiliary verb like be, we get it with been, or if it's the main verb, so could, well, left is not a great example because it's irregular, but eat could have eaten, could have eaten, could have partied, where you get ed. So we can see these with these different elements. So in the Carney textbook, he handles these through lexical selection, wherein you have lexical frames where have says, I select for a lower verb that has the following characteristics. It has en or ed as its marker. Another way we can do this, which is going to tie into the sort of notion that we're going to play into, is that these are really two-part auxiliaries. So have is composed of both have plus this like ed-en marker, and that ed-en marker sort of hops down in the tree and goes down to the next lower thing. Either approach is fine. So I'll just draw a quick tree to show you how that would work. So the lexical selection tree looks exactly like the tree we just did. I'm going to draw a little bit more simple of a tree to show you how a hop down tree would work. So we'll say could have left. So here we have Mary could have left the party, and the critical piece is that we're paying attention to is this piece right here. Ud moving down, and it's going to, some sort of morphological rule will obviously shift leave into left. And that's sort of the critical difference between the sort of lexical selection approach that we see in the Carney textbook and what this approach is known as, which is a lowering approach, where you're going to build up each of these auxiliaries into two different components and split them apart. And we'll utilize this in our passive auxiliary, passive construction as well. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is dealing with how these heads can sort of interact with things. And I want to look at a really interesting interaction that we see between different languages. So one of the things we want to think about is how we can sort of define the edge of what we think of as the verb phrase. So we know that we can get modifiers at the bar level. So we can say something like Selicum always eats apples. If we treat a structure like this, so we have our structure like this, and we can see here is our adverbial, and it sort of marks the edge of what we might call, the verb phrase relative to its object. And we can note certain things about this that it's certainly not permissible to say Selicum eats always apples. That's pretty bad. So one of the mysteries we've had with this sort of tense relationship is how do we get this relationship between tense and the verb to exist? And so in sort of, again, thinking about the kind of structure we have in the Carney textbook, well, one of the ways that Carney kind of thinks about it is, again, through that selectional relationship. Another way we can do that for English is that there's something that happens at a different stage in syntax, which says, okay, if you haven't moved up in the syntax, then you have to move down. And that's basically what happens to tense. And we'll see that things can interfere with this. So one of the things that we can see that interferes with this is negation. So if we are negating this sentence, Selicum doesn't always eat apples. We'll notice that does is a required element. That you cannot say that sentence without including a does. Well, what is that does's purpose in that sentence? Well, it really is a overt realization of this tense. It's making the tense surface. And why is it doing that? Well, because something's interfering with the relationship between the tense and the verb. In that case, negation. And another key relationship we're going to see in just a second here is question formation. which can also interfere with this, particularly yes-no questions. But before we do that, I want to look at French. French behaves in the exact opposite way with respect to these adverbials that English does. So if we are speaking French, which I do not speak, and I'm not going to try to pronounce too much French because I don't have a very good French pronunciation. But one of the sentence is very similar to the sentence that we saw in English. The key difference is that the surface order I eat often the apples. There's our adverbial, there's our verb, there's our object. That adverb is interfering, is coming in between that object and that verb in the exact way that we said shouldn't happen. Well, how can we do that? Well, basically, we're just going to flip that lowering into a raising. We're going to have what's called head movements. So the French sentence looks almost identical to the English sentence in virtually every way, with one key difference. Rather than lowering tense down here, the verb is going to move up into tense. And that is going to give us this surface order. This is going to make another critical prediction for us, though. Because think how we form yes-no questions in English. Well, in English, we take the auxiliary verb, if there is one, and move it to the front of a sentence to form a yes-no question. So, can John eat apples? From the declarative sentence, John can eat apples. But when there is no when there is no auxiliary, no modal, no other type of auxiliary, what do we do in that case? We insert a do and move that up. So we grab a I erased that thing. We grab the tense, which is where we've been putting those auxiliaries, and we move it up. But when that tense is contentless, we insert a do. And how do we do that? Well, let's again look at our English sentences. So we'll take the sentence, can John eat apples? And I'm going to leave us a little bit of space. So we have John eat apples. I'm sorry. I don't want to make the sentence, can John eat apples? That's easy for us to deal with relatively. I want to say, make the sentence, does John eat apples? So we know this is a tense and it's minus past. What do we have to do to make this a question? Well, we have to grab it and we have to move. We have to take this auxiliary. Well, there is no auxiliary. We have to take tense and move that to in front of the subject. Well, now we need to utilize a position we haven't really utilized since we've been playing around with X bar, which is going back to those complementizer positions. So we're going to reapply the same rules, X bar rules, to our complementizers. And we're going to have a complementizer here that says, I'm a question. And that's going to be what grabs this tense node. It's going to say, hey, tense node, move me up here. And so the tense node is going to move up. But the tense node isn't moving really anything. It's moving something. But that something doesn't have content to be pronounced. So it moves up. But then when it comes time for the phonology to say, okay, we're going to pronounce our question, the phonology goes, there's nothing to identify that this is a question. So the phonology says, you need to give me some content here, make this tense pronounceable, so we insert our do. And that's what gives us, does John eat apples? This is the same do that surfaces when negation interferes with that lowering. This is the same do that anytime that tense cannot show up with that verb, we find this do. We call this do support. So these are examples of head movements where that tense and that verb's relationship is broken apart. There's something interfering with that. It could be negation. It could be movement due to a question. And so do comes in. That's where we're going to stop today. There's kind of a lot here. We'll pick this back up with integrating a little bit more of head movement with DP movement, and we'll look at the passive next video. The passive's really fun and really interesting. Thank you again. As always, I want to kind of close off by giving a little bit of some wisdom from some philosophers. I've given some, I think, losing track a little bit, but I know some Epictetus, some Marcus Aurelius, maybe some Seneca. I'm going to go with some Fred Rogers today. And again, this is going to be a fairly short one, but I know just there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of kind of suffering right now. So again, I just want to try to find some quotes that I think are really kind of inspiring to help us try to get through this. So again, this is Fred Rogers, also maybe more famously known as Mr. Rogers. Some of my richest experiences have come out of the most painful times. Those that were the hardest to believe would ever turn into anything positive. And with that, I will stop and wish you all good health and good luck through this really trying time. And I hope to see you next time. Great. Thank you.